On the 8th of May 1945, the Third Reich signed its unconditional surrender. The generals stamped their signatures, the soldiers dropped their weapons. The world opened the champagne, but the bunkers did not surrender. They were there, with their corroded steel doors, their flooded corridors, their 8-meter-thick concrete walls guarding what no one had had time to destroy, what no one had wanted the world to see, what even those who built it preferred to bury rather than explain. For decades they remained sealed. The Soviets blew up the entrances. The Allies catalogued them and abandoned them. Grass grew over them, roads were built on top, cities rose over their concrete roofs. And then, in the 21st century, someone started digging. What they found inside changes what we thought we knew about that war. Skeletons without hands or feet, rockets abandoned exactly where they were left in 1945, ash pits with the remains of thousands of men, a crypt where Heinrich Himmler wanted an eternal flame to burn over the skulls of his dead generals, a salt mine with the greatest art theft in human history. And tunnels, kilometers of tunnels, where the questions still have no answer. This is what the Nazi bunkers kept for 80 years. In February 2024, a team of archaeologists and historians from the La Tebra Foundation reached the remains of the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, in what were the forests of East Prussia, and today belong to the northeast of Poland, a short distance from the city of Kętrzyn. The objective was to document the state of conservation of the underground structures that still remained standing, mostly detonated by German forces in January 1945 before their retreat in the face of the advance of the Belarusian front of Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The Wolfschanze had been Adolf Hitler's main headquarters on the Eastern Front from June 1941 until the 20th of November 1944. A complex of more than 250 hectares of thick and swampy forest, divided into 3 concentric security zones, with 17 main bunkers and more than 2,000 people of permanent staff. No one expected what they found under the floor of the residence of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. A few centimeters from the surface, under what had been an old bathroom located in the basement of the building, archaeologists found 5 human skeletons. All were arranged in the same direction. None had hands, none had feet. The remains belonged to 3 adults, a teenager, and a baby. There was no clothing. There were no personal objects, nothing that would allow them to be identified immediately. The find was reported by National Geographic, The Guardian, and Reuters in the following days. Polish authorities authorized an official forensic investigation immediately. Teams from the Forensic Institute of Krakow and the Polish Scientific Police began analyses of radiocarbon dating, comparative osteology, and mitochondrial DNA. The absence of extremities poses 2 main hypotheses that researchers continue to evaluate in parallel. The first is differential decomposition. In soils with a certain chemical composition, the distal extremities can degrade faster than the long bones of the body, especially in the presence of persistent humidity and organic acids derived from the decomposition of plant matter. The soils of the East Prussian forest, rich in peat and with irregular drainage, meet those conditions. The second hypothesis is deliberate mutilation, pre-mortem or post-mortem, a practice documented in contexts of summary executions during the German occupation of Arschli. Provisional dating places the remains in a range that spans from the end of the 1930s until January 1945, when the complex was evacuated and partially destroyed. The presence of a baby and a teenager among the 5 bodies almost completely rules out an execution related to combat or prisoners of war. The hypotheses that the forensics handle include forced workers without documentary records, victims of occupation violence in the region, or people who had contact with the high commands of the Reich that someone considered necessary to hide permanently. This did not happen in an anonymous open field. It happened in the residence of the second most powerful man of the Third Reich. Göring lived meters from those 5 bodies. Whether he ignored them or knew they were there is a question that the bones cannot answer. The Wolfschanze today receives some 200,000 visitors a year. Its overturned bunkers, its flooded corridors, its concrete walls remain standing. Under that same earth, According to the archaeologists of the Latebra Foundation, it is likely that more secrets remain undiscovered. 5 bodies without hands or feet, buried under the house of the man who in March 1941 told a Swedish diplomat that Heinrich Himmler was too soft with the enemies of the Reich. Science works. The questions remain open. Among the 5 skeletons, there is one that stops any forensic analysis before it begins. Because forensic analyses are designed to answer questions about adults, about combatants, about victims of documented contexts, a newborn baby under the wolf's lair does not fit into any category that the archives of the Third Reich even contemplated as a possibility. The remains are those of a neonate, an individual who had lived at best a few weeks. The osteological studies of the bone material, carried out with the inevitable restrictions imposed by the degradation of time, confirm it. The dimensions of the cranial bones, the state of the calcified cartilages, the length of the long bones. A baby. There is no military scenario that explains this body. The presence of a newborn necessarily implies the presence of a mother. A mother in the Wolfschanze in the first security zone, the inner circle of the headquarters, is an anomaly of such caliber that researchers have not found any parallel in the existing documentation about the complex. The only women registered in that area were secretaries and highly selected auxiliary personnel subjected to exhaustive security controls. This suggests that the baby, its mother, and the other 4 people who lie next to them represent something that no one registered because no one wanted to register it. The absolute clandestinity of that burial, without clothes, without objects, without identification, a few centimeters from the surface in a soil that would have been trodden daily by the personnel of the headquarters, speaks of a particular urgency and of an express will that no trace remained. The mitochondrial DNA analyses extracted from the 3 adults have not found matches in any international genetic database of relatives of the disappeared from the Second World War. The bone degradation of the baby and the teenager complicates the extraction of sufficient genetic material for a complete genomic analysis. While the definitive results of radiocarbon dating remain without official publication, the question that the newborn baby asks is not scientific. It is moral, and it is 80 years old. The news that Sky News published in February 2024 about the find in the Wolfschanze underlined a detail that the archaeologists of the Latebra Foundation could not explain quickly: the uniform absence of hands and feet in the 5 skeletons. But what that report did not develop was that this detail was not an isolated phenomenon of the Polish forest, where Hermann Göring resided during the war years. It was part of a pattern that the forensic archaeology of the Second World War has repeatedly found in the 21st century in bunkers and underground structures across Central and Eastern Europe. In 2017, during the remodeling works of a historic building in the center of Poznan, a city in western Poland that the SS called Posen during the occupation, the workers who were removing the concrete foundations of what had been a Gestapo basement found in the compacted earth floor the remains of 4 adult individuals. 3 of them lacked the distal phalanges of the hands. The 4th had no feet. The Polish Institute of National Remembrance assumed the forensic investigation. Radiocarbon analyses placed the remains in the period of German occupation between 1939 and 1945. Osteological analyses ruled out differential decomposition as the cause of the absence of extremities. The structure of the bones of the stumps presented cut marks compatible with bladed instruments which indicated separation by mechanical means or by a sharp instrument. In the basements of the Gestapo, the Revier, the interrogation space where the most extreme methods of physical coercion were applied without external witnesses, was an architectural constant of the system. The documentation of the Nuremberg trials and subsequent denazification processes includes testimonies of survivors who describe mutilations practiced in interrogations, but the selective survival of those testimonies only survivors could speak means that the documentation of the fate of those who did not survive those interrogations is necessarily fragmentary. In the case of Poznan, none of the 4 individuals could be identified. DNA analyses found no matches with any database of relatives of the disappeared from the Second World War in Poland, Germany, Ukraine or Belarus. Their names remain unknown. In 2019, during a preventive archaeological excavation in Minsk Mazowiecki, a city in central Poland, where the SS established in 1942 a transit facility for deportations to the Treblinka extermination camp, archaeologists from the Institute of National Remembrance found in a pit adjacent to the foundations of an SS building the remains of 11 individuals. 4 of them presented an absence of hands, 2 lacked feet. Forensic analyses of the bone marks identified in some cases cuts with a metal instrument. In others, the degradation of the bone material was too advanced to allow a clear reading. The Minsk Mazowiecki pit was catalogued. 2 of the 11 individuals could be identified through DNA. A man between 30 and 40 years old of genetic origin compatible with the Jewish population of the region, and a woman between 20 and 30 years old whose genetic sample matched a family from the city that had filed a missing person report with the Institute of National Remembrance in the 90s. The remaining 9 have no name. What unites the Gestapo basement in Poznań, the Minsk Mazowiecki pit and the 5 skeletons under Göring's residence in the Wolfschanze is not only the absence of extremities, it is the absence of documentation. The SS did not record what happened in those spaces because recording it would have created evidence of what they did. The destruction of evidence was part of the method, not a later addition, but the ground does not destroy the evidence. It preserves it. And when, in the 21st century, archaeologists reached those basements and those pits, they found what the SS had tried to make disappear. The pattern that emerges: mutilations, burials without identification, absence of personal objects, locations within or adjacent to SS facilities, is not random. It is the material trail of a system that operated for 12 years and that believed it had erased its traces deep enough so that no one would ever find them. The forensic archaeology of the 21st century is proving that this calculation was incorrect. The presence of 3 adults, a teenager and a baby in the same pit under the same building, buried in the same direction and without any object of identification, has led several researchers to suggest that the 5 bodies could belong to a family. It is not a far-fetched hypothesis. Forensic archaeology of the Second World War in Central and Eastern Europe has repeatedly documented the joint burial of complete families in contexts of mass execution by the SS and the Gestapo. On the 1 of September 1939, the same day that the invasion of Poland began, units of Einsatzgruppe 1 began executing entire families in the occupied territory. The operational logic of those executions eliminating witnesses, erasing kinship ties, preventing any thread that could be pulled favored joint burial. But there is something in the Wolfschanze that differentiates this case from the usual patterns of those massacres. The mass executions of the Intelligenzaktion, the systematic operation of eliminating the Polish intellectual and social elite that began in September 1939, were carried out in forests and open fields, at a distance from German facilities, not under the private residences of the high commands of the Reich. A burial under a building implies premeditation. It implies access to the construction space. It implies a deliberate decision to use the residence of the Reichsmarshal himself as a place of permanent concealment. Mitochondrial DNA analyses could answer if there is a matrilineal kinship relationship between the 3 adults and the baby. But those analyses require samples of sufficient quality, and the state of degradation of part of the bone material has complicated extraction. While the results remain unpublished, the question of who this family was, if they were one, remains unanswered. Historian Piotr Wysakowski from the Military History Institute of Warsaw pointed out in an interview with the portal Onet Historia that the Wolfschanze was a space of power where executions of forced workers who had seen too much were documented practice, although rarely recorded in official archives. The fact that the construction of the complex between 1941 and 1944 employed thousands of workers from the TOT organization, many of them Polish and Soviet citizens, adds another layer of possibility to the identity of those 5 bodies. Under the residence of the second man of the Reich, the Earth kept what its occupants decided should never come to light. 80 years later it came out. In September 1943, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler ordered the urgent relocation of the production of the A4 rocket, the future Phi-2, from the Peenemünde Research Center on the Baltic coast, which had been severely damaged by a night raid of the RAF on the 17th of August 1943 to an underground site in the interior of the Reich. The place chosen was the system of galleries of the Kohnstein, a gypsum mountain in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, near the city of Nordhausen in Thuringia. The galleries had been originally excavated by the state company WIFO Wirtschaftliche Forschungsgesellschaft as an underground strategic fuel depot. In September 1943, the first 107 prisoners from the Buchenwald concentration camp arrived at the Kohnstein to begin the work of expanding and converting the tunnels into an underground weapons factory. There were no barracks. There were no sheds. There was no surface installation prepared to house the prisoners. The Schlafstollen dormitory galleries were the transverse chambers of the tunnel system. Those numbered 43 to 46, where the SS engineers installed 4-level wooden bunks. In those bunks inside a mountain, up to 10,500 prisoners slept for months in conditions that the testimony of survivors describes with a consistency that eliminates any margin of exaggeration. There was no proper ventilation. The gypsum dust that the prisoners excavated by hand and with pneumatic tools permeated the air 24 hours a day. There were no sanitary facilities. Oil barrels cut in half served as latrines placed between the bunks. Water was scarce and contaminated. Temperatures inside the mountain remained stable at around 12 degrees Celsius throughout the year, which meant constant humidity and no means of drying the clothes wet with sweat and rain that the prisoners wore on their skin. Dr. André Sellier, a French historian and survivor of the camp, wrote in his testimony collected in the catalogue of the exhibition Images de Dora 1943 to 1945 that in the first months of the camp's existence, in the winter of 1943 to 1944, the prisoners worked 14 hours, slept in the galleries of the mountain, and then went back to work without ever going to the surface, without seeing the sun, without seeing the sky. The only light was from the electric lamps of the tunnel, which flickered when the system's load failed. On the 10th of December 1943, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments of the Reich, visited the Kohnstein tunnels accompanied by his staff. According to testimonies later collected by the investigators of the Dachau trial against the camp personnel in 1947, several members of Speer's team were so disturbed by what they saw bodies of prisoners abandoned among the rubble, men working in a state of advanced malnutrition, the accumulated smell of thousands of people without possible hygiene inside the mountain, that they requested a period of leave upon returning to Berlin. Speer sent a letter of congratulations to engineer Kammler, responsible for the construction, pointing out the success in transforming the underground facilities. Between October 1943 and March 1944, out of a total of 17,500 slave workers, almost 2,900 died in Dora. The mortality rate of the Dora work crews was, at the end of 1943, the highest in the concentration camp system in all of Europe. The Schlafstollen of the Kohnstein are today one of the parts of the underground complex accessible to the public at the Mittelbau Dora Memorial. The visitor who descends to those galleries walks through the same space where 10,000 men slept crowded among the rockets they would build during the day. The 4 rows of bunks are no longer there, but the marks on the concrete, the cracks in the gypsum, the darkness that artificial light cannot completely dissipate, that remains there. When the American troops of the 4th Army Corps, under the command of General Mantens Eddy, arrived in Nordhausen on the 11th of April 1945, they found in the surface facilities of the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp several hundred corpses of prisoners that the SS guards had abandoned before fleeing north. Those who could walk had been forced to march, but inside the mountain, in the tunnels of the Mittelwerk, they found something different. The production lines of the V-2 rockets were exactly as their operators had left them the last time they worked on them. A-4 rockets in various stages of assembly rested on their transport carts along the rails of the main galleries. The thrusters, the turbopumps, the guidance gyroscopes, the aluminum aerodynamic fairings, the components of the V-2 lay scattered on the floor exactly where the prisoners and German technicians had placed them when the evacuation alarm sounded. In Tunnel A, the southernmost of the system, American observers found several partially assembled rocket engines. In Gallery 41, the highest in the system, and where the vertical inspection structures were located that allowed the rockets to be placed in an erect position for final verification of the gyroscopes, a bridge crane was still hanging from its rails. Below, the remains of what seemed to be a complete V-2 but disassembled for some type of component test. Engineer Werner von Braun, technical director of the rocket program in Peenemünde and a central figure in the rocket armament program since 1936, had surrendered to American forces on the 2nd of May 1945 along with more than 100 of his closest collaborators. With him, he carried microfilms with the complete technical plans of the A-4. Von Braun and his engineers would be moved to the United States under Operation Paperclip and would become the core of the American space program that would culminate in Apollo 11. But what remained in the Kohnstein tunnels were the physical proofs of the system that von Braun took on microfilm. The archives of the Mittelbau Dora Memorial preserve photographs taken by American Army photographer George Phillips in the days following the liberation. In them, sections of rockets are seen leaning against the tunnel walls, propellant tanks stacked on the sides of the galleries, fragments of aerodynamic fairings scattered on the rock floor. In 1947, the Soviet military administration, which had assumed control of the area when the occupation borders were established, tried to blow up the interior of the tunnels with explosives, in compliance with the Allied agreement to destroy German military facilities. The attempt was partially successful. The 4 accesses to the complex were sealed, but the main galleries, excavated in high-hardness gypsum rock, resisted the detonation without completely collapsing. The interior remained sealed, with its production lines abandoned and the remains of the rockets still in place. It was not until the second half of the 1990s, when the complex was partially reopened as a memorial and museum, that the site workers documented the exact state of what the Soviet detonation had inadvertently preserved. In the parts of the tunnel accessible today to the public, fragments of thrusters, sections of aluminum sheet, and pieces of the guidance systems lie under glass cases in the museum section of Tunnel A. But in the parts of the complex that remain closed, flooded, or at risk of collapse due to the continuous process of gypsum extraction in the surrounding mountain, the question of what else remained exactly as in 1945 still lacks a complete answer. A V-2 rocket, built with slave labor inside a mountain, can reach an altitude of more than 80 kilometers. The fragments of those rockets never traveled further than the rails of a gallery in the Kohnstein. The distance between those two possible destinations is the distance between technology and crime. Outside the Kohnstein tunnel complex, on the southern slope of the mountain where the SS engineers built the Dora barracks camp in the first quarter of 1944, there is a building that visitors to the memorial find after passing through the main esplanade, the crematorium. In the archaeology of Nazi concentration camps, crematoriums are structures that historians and the general public usually associate with Auschwitz-Birkenau, with Treblinka, with the great extermination centers of the East. But Mittelbau Dora had its own, built in 1944 to solve a specific logistical problem. The quantity of corpses that the rocket production system generated at a rate that exceeded the capacity of individual burial procedures. The first period of the camp, between October 1943 and March 1944, was the deadliest. In those 5 months, almost 2,900 men died. Their bodies were moved to the crematorium of Buchenwald, the main camp of which Dora was a subcamp. But that solution had logistical limits. With the growth of the camp and the start of rocket production, its own facility became necessary. The Mittelbau-Dora crematorium was built with slave labor between the summer and autumn of 1944. When American troops liberated it on the 11th of April 1945, they found uncremated corpses inside piled on top of each other, since in the days prior to the evacuation of the camp, the load had exceeded the processing capacity of the ovens. The SS records for the entire Mittelbau camp system record approximately 12,000 deaths between 1943 and 1945. But investigators of the 1947 Dachau trial and later historians have systematically pointed out that this figure is a significant underestimate. The prisoners who arrived in terminal conditions from the evacuations of Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen in early 1945 were not always individually registered. The prisoners who died in the tunnels during the work shift did not always reach the registration system. The real number of dead is estimated between 20,000 and 30,000. The crematorium is today the only original building of the barracks camp that remains standing in the memorial grounds. The rest was demolished in the 50s to use the wood as fuel and construction material in post-war Nordhausen. The brick building of the crematorium was declared a historical monument in 1944 in a ceremony attended by thousands of people before any permanent exhibition about the camp existed. The decision to preserve the crematorium while demolishing the rest was, in a way, a decision about which part of history was more difficult to ignore. The barracks where the prisoners slept could be imaginatively reconstructed. The oven where they burned them did not need imagination. The history of the Mittelbau-Dora crematorium does not end with the building that visitors can see today at the memorial. It ends in the ground. The remains of incineration in the crematoriums of Nazi concentration camps were not always treated in accordance with the official procedures that the SS had established in their protocols. The protocols established that the ashes of the prisoners should be stored until the volume justified their transfer to a collective pit, which in the case of the large eastern camps was usually located in the perimeter of the complex. In Mittelbau-Dora, the ash pit was excavated in the ground adjacent to the crematorium. There, mixed with slag from the ovens and soil from the Kohnstein, the remains of thousands of people ended up whose identity was erased in two successive phases. First by the SS numbering system, which replaced the names of the prisoners with a figure, and then by the fire of the crematorium, which converted the bodies into dust without distinction. The Mittelbau-Dora Memorial has marked the location of the ash pit as part of the historical tour of the complex. The earth over it has no special marks. It has no name. It is an extension of ground like any other except for what is underneath. This type of pit, not a mass grave in the conventional sense, but a deposit of mixed ashes from thousands of different individuals, poses a specific problem to forensic archaeology that has no currently available technical solution. DNA analysis of charred remains is possible under certain conditions, but it requires bone fragments of sufficient size and with a degree of preservation of genetic material that incineration almost always destroys. In the Mittelbau-Dora ash pit, individual identification is impossible with current means. This means that the people who ended up in that pit are, in forensic terms, unrecoverable. Their names cannot be relinked to their remains. Their families, if they survived, and if they searched for decades for some sign of where their fathers, their brothers, their sons ended up, those families cannot receive the answer they seek. The earth has them, but it cannot return them. The Italian writer and survivor Primo Levi, who was a prisoner in Auschwitz between February 1944 and January 1945, wrote in The Drowned and the Saved, 1986, that the purpose of the SS documentary destruction system was precisely that the dead had no name, that they were numbers during life and dust afterward. The system worked in Mittelbau-Dora with the same efficiency as in the other camps. The ash pit is its most permanent expression. At 24 meters under Nuremberg's imperial castle, in a labyrinth of medieval galleries excavated in sandstone rock since the 14th century, American soldiers found in April 1945 something that no one expected to find in a war bunker: the crown, the scepter, the orb, and the sword of the Holy Roman Empire. The Reichskleinodion, the imperial insignia that medieval emperors had used for centuries as a symbol of their authority over Europe, were hidden behind a masonry wall in copper boxes ordered personally by Himmler. The Nazis had moved them from Vienna in 1938 with the intention that Nuremberg, the city of the party congresses, would be the new symbolic center of the Third Reich. Along with the regalia, the soldiers found the oldest terrestrial globe in the world, the Erdapfel made by Martin Behaim in 1492, the altar of the Annunciation by Veit Stoss, stolen from Krakow Cathedral, works by Dürer, and stained glass windows from churches throughout Germany. Above their heads, Allied bombing had reduced Nuremberg to rubble. Inside the mountain, the air conditioning installed by the Nazis had kept the works in perfect condition. The most disturbing thing about that discovery was not what was inside the bunker. It was what had happened outside, on the surface, while the regalia waited in the dark. The Nazi fanatic Karl Holz, who commanded the defense of the city, had ordered the public execution of 4 civilians for trying to surrender the city and had sent 35 more to the Dachau concentration camp. When Mayor Willy Liebel tried to secretly contact the Americans to negotiate surrender and save the contents of the bunker, Holz entered the shelter where he was hiding and shot him in the head. The regalia survived. Liebel did not. On the 4 and 5 of January 1946, the imperial insignia were returned to the Hofburg in Vienna, where they remain today. The Historische Kunstbunker of Nuremberg can be visited through a guided tour. In 2016, the foundation works of a residential building of 134 apartments in the center of Berlin stopped abruptly when the ground probes hit a layer of concrete of unexpected thickness. The engineers measured between 95 and 100 meters in length, 2 meters in width, and almost 2 in height. A sealed Nazi tunnel built between 1943 and 1945 with slave labor had survived intact under the floor of the reunified capital. Historian Dietmar Arnold from the Berliner Unterwelt and the Association of Berlin Underground Worlds confirmed that the structure was part of the system of interconnected underground facilities that the Reich built to protect the high commands of the party from Allied bombing. The air inside, when the technicians opened the first access point, was described as stale and heavy, the smell of a space that had been without communication with the outside for 70 years. The exact location of the find was not just any Berlin plot. It was a few meters from the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. Inaugurated in 2005, Berlin has nearly 200 bunkers built during the war. The underground ones, designed for the party elite, are the least documented because they are the least accessible. The Berliner Unterwelten has systematically catalogued these spaces since the 90s, finding in several of them objects that their last occupants left exactly where they were in the spring of 1945. Documentation, communications equipment, office furniture, propaganda posters. Every time the excavators of a new construction in the center of Berlin hit a layer of concrete thicker than expected, the city faces the same question again: what to do with what is underneath? The answer, most of the time, is to fill it in and build on top. In August 1985, a group of Berlin historical activists who called themselves the Aktivmuseum Faschismus und Widerstand Active Museum of Fascism and Resistance arrived with shovels at a degraded plot on Prinz-Albrecht-Straße in the Kreuzberg district on the western side of Berlin. The plot had been without official use for decades. It had served successively as a post-war rubble dump, as a driving practice track for driving schools, and as an eventual proposed helipad area. No one passing by in 1985 would have known what was underneath. The activists knew, and they began to dig. What came out of the ground changed forever what Berlin was willing to remember about itself. Under the plot on which no one had wanted to build anything permanent since 1945, the volunteer archaeologists of the Aktivs Museum found the foundations, walls, and underground structures of the most feared buildings in 20th century Europe. Number 8, Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, had been the central headquarters of the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei. the secret state police from 1933 until the spring of 1945. The adjacent building, number 9, housed the central direction of the SS under the direct command of Himmler. The Prinz Albrecht Palais at number 102 Wilhelmstrasse had been the headquarters of the Reich Security Service, the SD. In that triangle of blocks in the center of Berlin, Himmler, Heydrich and their successors had directed the system of terror that extended throughout occupied Europe. The Allied bombing of 1945 had destroyed the upper floors of the buildings. The post-war years had demolished what remained standing. But the basements, the underground levels where the Gestapo installed in the summer of 1933 what its own documents called Hausgefängnis, the house prison, survived under the layers of rubble and earth accumulated. The excavations of 1985, converted into a formal archaeological project from 1987 coinciding with the 750th anniversary of the city of Berlin, revealed a system of individual detention cells, access corridors, and interrogation spaces that had remained sealed under the ground for 40 years. The excavated cells have dimensions that archaeologists documented with millimetric precision. Approximately 2 meters in width, 3 meters in length, and a little more than 2 meters in height. The brick walls preserved, in some cases, inscriptions made by the prisoners with any object they could find. Chalk fragments, nails, their own fingers on the damp lime. Some of those messages were preserved during the excavations. On one of the walls appeared traced in irregular letters the characters of a name and a date that the researchers of the Topography of Terror Foundation identified as compatible with the Gestapo detention records of 1936. What the archaeologists found in the excavated space of the Gestapo's Hausgefängnis was not just architecture. It was the physical container of 15,000 individual stories. The Gestapo imprisoned a total of 15,000 opponents of the National Socialist regime in the house prison between 1933 and 1945. They were not prisoners of war or internees in concentration camps. They were detainees awaiting interrogation, an interrogation that the Reich's legislation had designed to happen outside of any legal control, under the concept of Schutzhaft, protective custody, which in practice meant indefinite detention without trial or formal charges, executed by a police force that responded directly to Himmler and that was legally above the ordinary courts of the Reich. Among the 15,000 who passed through those cells were Georg Else, the Bavarian carpenter, who in November 1939 alone placed a time bomb in the column of the podium of the Bürger Bräukeller in Munich, where Hitler was going to speak, and who failed by 13 minutes to kill the dictator and members of the resistance groups of the Kreisau Circle and the Red Orchestra, as well as officers involved in the assassination attempt of the 20th of July 1944, some of whom were interrogated in those same cells before being transferred to Plötzensee prison, where they would be executed. Else was held in the Hausgefängnis for years. In conditions of relative privileged detention, the Gestapo wanted to keep him alive in case they ever needed to prove that the attack had been a foreign conspiracy. He was transferred to the Dachau concentration camp in 1944 and murdered on the 9th of April 1945, 4 weeks before the end of the war, by direct order of Hitler. The excavation of the Gestapo cells on Prinz Albrechtstrasse was the starting point of the project that would become the Topography of Terror today, one of the most visited centers of documentation on Nazism in the world, with more than 1 million annual visitors. The exterior space of the old plot, where the walls of the excavated basements are visible from above through an archaeological trench that runs parallel to the last preserved section of the Berlin Wall, allows the 21st century visitor to look down at the brick walls and see exactly the same space seen by those who were imprisoned in it. There was also an additional find that the 1985 excavators did not expect. In the excavated basement of the adjacent building, the one that had housed the SS offices, archaeologists found uniforms and documents that had been stored in that space, and that the chaos of the last days of the Reich and the bombings had sealed under the rubble. Some of those documents were deportation orders with official SS letterhead. Others were personal files of officers. The material was transferred to the Bundesarchive and catalogued. A small but significant part of that documentation was in a state of conservation that archivists described as surprising. The sealed environment and the absence of humidity in the part of the basement where they had been deposited had kept them legible for 40 years under the rubble of Berlin. The cells of the Gestapo's Hausgefängnis on Prinz Albrechtstrasse were not discovered by any accident or by any construction work. They were discovered because in 1985, a group of citizens decided that the earth covering what had happened on that plot had no right to continue being a parking lot, that there was something underneath that the world had an obligation to see. They were right. On the 1st of January 1988, personnel from the Stasi, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the state security service of the German Democratic Republic, descended into the interior of the Führerbunker in Berlin for the first time since the Soviet military administration had sealed its accesses after the demolition attempts of 1947. What they found inside, and what they did with it, is one of the strangest episodes in the long history of the most famous bunker of the Second World War. The Führerbunker had remained closed and for the most part inaccessible for 40 years, not because no one had wanted to enter, but because the reinforced concrete structure with a roof nearly 3 meters thick had resisted all previous attempts at destruction. The Soviets had blown up parts of the Vorbunker, the upper antibunker, finished in 1936 in December 1947, damaging the internal partition walls but without succeeding in collapsing the main structure. The lower level, the Führerbunker proper, located 8.5 meters under the garden of the former Reich Chancellery, had survived practically intact, flooded by the water table of Berlin and sealed under the rubble of subsequent demolitions. Since 1961, the inter-German border, the Berlin Wall, ran along the south side of what was formerly Prinz Albrechtstrasse, renamed Niederkirchner Straße. The plot where the Führerbunker was located was left on the eastern side in the exclusion strip of the wall without any construction project being able to develop. That geopolitical circumstance, which for decades seemed like a curse for any attempt at managing the site, was inadvertently the condition that preserved the bunker underground for 4 additional decades. In 1988, the GDR government decided to build a luxury housing complex on the outer edge of the wall's strip in the area adjacent to the bunker plot. The excavations for the foundations were inevitably going to go through parts of the underground complex. Before the excavators entered, the Stasi was authorized to carry out a documentary record of the interior. In April 1988, the East German government allowed several site visits by photojournalists. The water from the Vorbunker was pumped out for 4 days before it was possible to gain access through the underground passage that led from the foundations of the old Chancellery. The interior floor of the Vorbunker was covered with a muddy sludge from having been underwater for several years. The Stasi record produced filmed and photographic documentation in color, exceptional for a space that had not been photographed since May 1945, that was kept classified for years, and that surfaced gradually in German archives after reunification. What those images showed was a space frozen in time, in a way that no architectural reconstruction could have reproduced. The corridors of the Vorbunker preserved part of the original tiling of the walls, visibly damaged by fire and water but recognizable. In the kitchen of the small service section of the Vorbunker, empty wine bottles lay on the floor exactly where they had been left in the last days of April 1945, when the inhabitants of the bunker drank what was left, while Soviet guns shook the concrete over their heads. In the room next to the kitchen were the broken frames of the bunks that the children of Joseph and Magda Goebbels had used, the 6 children who lived in the Vorbunker from the 22nd of April 1945 until the 1st of May, when their mother administered the barbiturates that left them unconscious before inserting cyanide capsules into their mouths. Hugh Trevor Roper, who visited the bunker in September 1945 as part of his investigation for the British intelligence report on Hitler's death, described in the introduction to the 3rd edition of The Last Days of Hitler, 1956, having found in the bunker Hitler's engagement diary, a bound volume of 35 by 18 centimeters abandoned in the Führer's chair, where it had remained for 4 months without anyone picking it up. The Soviets, Trevor Roper wrote with a mixture of wonder and sarcasm, had left that crucial document in its place, while publicly declaring that they had no information about Hitler's whereabouts or fate. When the Stasi accessed the Vorbunker in 1988, what remained of the contents of the bunker was in the state that 40 years of humidity, periodic flooding, and neglect produce inorganic materials. But the inorganic elements metal, concrete, glass bottles, metal frames of the bunks had survived in conditions that allowed them to be unambiguously identified. Photographer Robert Conrad, who infiltrated the site disguised as a construction worker during the works of 1987 to 1988, and revealed his experiences and photographs to Der Spiegel in 2013, described corridors where electric cables hung from cracked ceilings, rooms where the plastering had detached from the walls in large plates, leaving the bare concrete, and in the central corridor of the Führerbunker, the conference corridor where Hitler presided over daily staff meetings in his final weeks, scorch marks on the floor compatible with the fire that Goebbels' team deliberately set on the 1st of May 1945, hours before the last group of survivors attempted to escape through the subway tunnels toward the north of Berlin. The demolition that followed the Stasi's record was, according to East Berlin's construction chief Erhard Giske, definitive. "We are blowing it all up," he told the Reuters agency in 1988. "Every last piece will be detonated so that no memory remains." That fantasy of total erasure was not fulfilled. The excavations of the apartment building foundations revealed that the lower Führerbunker had survived the demolitions of the GDR engineers in the same way it had survived all previous attempts. Its 4-meter-thick concrete structure was, quite simply, more resistant than any political will to eliminate it. The sections of the bunker that remained after the works of 1988 to 1989 were filled with sand, gravel, and rubble, and sealed under the parking lot and landscaped areas of the new residential complex. Today, at the corner of Inden Ministergärten with Gertrud Kolmarstrasse, a 3-minute walk from Potsdamer Platz, there is an information panel installed in June 2006 by the Berliner Unterwelten Association Berlin Underground Worlds. The panel contains a schematic diagram of the complex and a chronological summary of its history. Under the parking lot behind the panel, several meters deep, remain the fragments of the bunker's concrete that no demolition could completely destroy. The structure where Hitler married, dictated his testament, and shot himself in the right temple on the 30th of April 1945 at 3:30 in the afternoon still exists in fragments under the asphalt of one of the most anonymous neighborhoods in central Berlin. The empty wine bottles that the Stasi found in the kitchen of the Vorbunker in 1988 were documented and then buried under the rubble of the demolition. No one knows exactly where they were left, but they were there for 43 years, exactly where someone left them in the last days of April 1945, while the world that had surrounded them collapsed. In 1947 and 1948, the Soviet military administration of the occupation zone that included Nordhausen and the Kohnstein executed the mandate of the Allied Potsdam agreements for the destruction of German military facilities in the occupied territory. The Red Army engineers placed explosive charges in the 4 entrances of the Mittelwerk tunnel complex. The detonations sealed the accesses. The galleries of the Kohnstein were locked inside the mountain, with the production lines of rockets, the remains of the dismantled Schlafstollen, the fragments of production material, and the traces of everything that had happened inside between October 1943 and April 1945. The complex remained like this for nearly 50 years. It was not until the mid-1990s, with German reunification and the increasing public awareness about the history of the concentration camps associated with the production of Third Reich weaponry, that systematic work began to reopen parts of the complex for historical documentation and memorial purposes. The Buchenwald and Mittelbau-Dora Memorial Foundation assumed the management of the site and began a process of partial opening, cleaning, and consolidation of the galleries for public use. Tunnel A was partially reopened as a museum area. The visitor can today walk through a section of several hundred meters of the main gallery, with the transport rails still on the ground, under a lighting structure installed by the memorial that attempts to reproduce, without quite succeeding, the darkness that existed inside the mountain when the prisoners worked there. But the major part of the complex remains closed. Parts of Tunnel B are flooded by the water table. Sections of the transverse tunnels have suffered partial collapses caused by the continuous process of gypsum extraction in the mountain. The conestein continues to be commercially exploited, which generates micro-vibrations in the rock. Some of the deepest galleries of the complex have never been exhaustively documented since the reopening. After the entrances were blown up by the Soviet military administration in 1947 and 1948, the underground complex remained closed for many decades. What remained inside those decades of closure is in part an unknown that the archaeological investigation of the complex continues to try to clear with the available means. The silence of those tunnels for half a century was the condition that allowed part of what happened inside to reach today's researchers intact. It was also the condition that makes it impossible to know for sure what was lost, what was destroyed by humidity or collapse, what traces that could have answered unanswered questions turned to dust inside the sealed mountain. Among the most extraordinary photographic testimonies of the industrial archaeology of the Second World War are the images taken inside the Mittelwerk in the days immediately following the liberation of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp on the 11th of April, 1945. Photographer George Phillips, attached to the American Army, documented the exact state of the production lines of Tunnel A and Tunnel B. His photographs, preserved in the archives of the Mittelbau-Dora Memorial and in the funds of the United States Army, show something that the logic of war would make expect as impossible. A high-tech weapons factory stopped in the middle of work. In one of the most reproduced images of that documentation, a transport cart on rails carries on its platform the rear section of a partially assembled V2, the section that houses the engine and the nozzle deflectors, with the fairing panel still open, the cable connections visible, the screws not yet finished being tightened. The technician who was working on that rocket abandoned the tool and left. The rocket stayed where it was. The engine of a V2 photographed by Phillips in Tunnel A in 1945 was recovered during the cleaning operations of the complex and is today in the museum space of the gallery accessible to the public. It is an object of considerable dimensions. The A4 turbopump weighed about 900 kilograms without fuel, and its state of conservation is, for being a piece that spent decades inside a humid mountain, surprisingly good. The same state of abandonment documented in the production lines of the Mittelwerk was found by American troops in other Reich weapons facilities that the SS and technical personnel had evacuated precipitously before the Allied advance. But the Mittelwerk, sealed for decades after the Soviet detonation of its entrances, preserved that state of sudden interruption in a way that the other complexes accessible and subjected to looting and demolition in the post-war years could not maintain. The production lines of the Mittelwerk represent the exact moment in which the most advanced weapons program of the Second World War was interrupted not by technical defeat or by exhaustion of resources, but by the advance of the Allied armies. The production of V2 rockets was, in April 1945, at its maximum technical performance. That performance was possible because 20,000 people died building the facilities that produced it. The rocket abandoned on the transport cart and the rusted engine in the museum showcase are the same object seen from two angles of time. And the story they tell has the same weight regardless of which angle is used to look at them. In the second quarter of 1944, the trains began to arrive at the small Alpine town of Altaussee in the Austrian Salzkammergut, loaded with boxes marked with the designation Sonderauftrag Linz Special Commission Linz. Linz was Adolf Hitler's hometown, and the Sonderauftrag Linz was the official name of the project with which Hitler, since 1938, systematically accumulated works of art from all over Europe for the museum he planned to build in his city of origin, the Führer Museum, which in his plans would be the largest collection in the world, larger than the Louvre, larger than the Uffizi, larger than the Hermitage. To guard that collection while Allied bombing made it increasingly dangerous to maintain it in the surface museums and depots of the Reich, Hitler's art advisors chose the salt mines of untouched, a system of 137 galleries excavated in the Salt Mountain, with a stable internal temperature of 8 degrees Celsius throughout the year, a humidity level of 40%, and a depth that reached 800 meters below the surface in some points. Ideal conditions for the preservation of paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and art objects in general. What Hitler's and Göring's agents accumulated in those galleries between 1943 and 1945 represented the greatest act of cultural theft in the documented history of humanity. Between 1943 and 1945, the extensive complex of salt mines of untouched functioned as an enormous depot of stolen art, and also contained funds from Austrian collections. From August 1943, the treasures of Austrian churches, monasteries, and museums were moved to the mines for their protection, and from February 1944, a reserve of some 4,700 works of art stolen from all over Europe. Smithsonian Institution. When American troops arrived in untouched in May 1945, what they found inside the salt mine exceeded the expectations even of the specialists of the MFAA Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives, the Allied Army unit specifically created for the location and protection of cultural art in combat zones. According to reports from the monuments men and conservator George Stout, who was present at many of the recoveries in the mines, these were relatively dry with a low average relative humidity of 40%. Salzwelten. In the galleries they found the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb by Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert, the Ghent altarpiece stolen from St. Bavo's Cathedral in Belgium, the Madonna of Bruges by Michelangelo, stolen from the Church of Our Lady in Bruges in 1944, works by Rubens, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Dürer, the jewels of the Rothschild family, confiscated along with the rest of the heritage of the Jewish families of Vienna and Berlin. Italian art from Monte Cassino that Göring's units had taken while the Allies and German forces fought in the Abbey, but the mine almost did not get to be found intact. In April 1945, when the Allied troops approached the salt mine, Gauleiter August Eigruber gave orders to blow it up. For this purpose, he had 8 bombs of 500 kilograms each transported to the tunnels. Hitler countermanded Eigruber's order, but after the Führer's death, the Gauleiter ignored it. However, the general manager of the mine, Dr. Emmerich Perkmüller, became suspicious of those new crates, and his team removed them from the mine in the middle of the night. Using a system of small explosive charges, they sealed the entrance to the mine, keeping the treasures inside, waiting for the arrival of the Allies. Smithsonian Institution Salzwelten. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges traveled to the mine in an American Army truck in May 1945. It was returned to the Church of Our Lady of Bruges that same year, where it remains today in a side chapel, slightly worn and completely intact. By July 1945, it was reported that 6,577 paintings, 230 drawings and watercolors, 954 prints, 137 sculptures, and 129 pieces of armor had been removed from the mine. Salzwelten. And that was only untouched, the program of systematic art theft that the Nazis executed between 1933 and 1945 dispersed millions of cultural objects across Europe, burying them in mines, castles, monasteries, and bunkers. Estimates from the National World War II Museum speak of 5 million cultural objects displaced during the conflict. Decades later, thousands remain unlocated or unclaimed. 8 kilometers from the center of Zhytomyr, in the small Ukrainian village of Huivar, there is a bunker that most of the world does not know exists. It was built between October 1941 and July 1942 by Soviet prisoners of war under the orders of the SS. Its code name was Hegewald Reserved Forest. It was the personal headquarters of Heinrich Himmler on the Eastern Front, with its own airfield, residence, reception rooms, cemetery, and a system of underground tunnels with concrete walls 4.5 meters thick. Himmler spent significant periods in Hegewald between July 1942 and the summer of 1943. It was there, in those concrete corridors under the Ukrainian forest, that in the autumn of 1942 he convened the assembly of SS leaders that formally approved Plan Ost, the plan for colonization, expulsion, and exterminio of the Slavic population of the East to replace them with German settlers. When German forces retreated in November 1943, the SS destroyed the surface facilities of Hegewald. The underground complex, however, partially survived, protected by its own concrete. For decades, it was part of a Soviet and subsequently Ukrainian military base, inaccessible to the public. What Ukrainian researchers and journalists who have been able to access the non-military sections of the complex have found in its tunnels are the material remains of a bureaucracy that planned the largest demographic engineering program in history. Fragments of documentation, original SS signage, the structure of the communications rooms, and on the walls of the corridors, marks and inscriptions that the Soviet prisoners who built it left in the fresh concrete before it hardened. The place where the exterminio was designed bears the fingerprints of those who built it with their own hands. There is a place in the north of the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, in the small municipality of Buren, at the bottom of a valley next to the Alm River, where a triangular castle built between 1603 and 1609 guards in its two main rooms of the North Tower, something that no architectural plan from the early 17th century could have anticipated. The Obergruppenführersaal, the hall of the SS senior generals, and the crypt that is directly below it are what remains of Heinrich Himmler's vision for Wewelsburg Castle. A vision that, in the particular cosmology of the Reichsführer SS, went far beyond architecture. Himmler leased the castle in 1934 for 1 German mark a year and immediately began its transformation into the spiritual and ceremonial center of the SS. The project required the work of thousands of prisoners from the Niederhagen concentration camp, specifically built next to the castle for that purpose in 1941. At least 1,200 prisoners died in Niederhagen working on the restoration and expansion of the castle. The upper floor of the North Tower was converted into the Obergruppenführersaal, a considerable circular hall with 12 carved stone columns, 12 Romanesque arch windows, and in the exact center of the floor, embedded in the stone, a mosaic that Himmler called simply Schwarze Sonne, the Black Sun, a symbol of 12 esoteric spokes derived from medieval Germanic ornaments, which the SS adopted as a sign of internal identity, reserved for the circles closest to the Reichsführer. Directly below the Obergruppenführersaal, excavated in the rock of the base of the tower, was the crypt, an old medieval castle cistern converted by Himmler into a funeral ritual space. 12 stone pedestals arranged in a circle, a ventilation system designed to keep an eternal flame burning, and in the center, the intention to deposit the urns with the ashes of the 12 top SS generals as they died. There is no proof that the crypt was used for that purpose during the war years. Wewelsburg's own museum points out in its official documentation that neither of the two rooms was used during the Nazi era, and that no reliable information is available about their intended purposes. But the architecture of both spaces, the specificity of their design, the human cost of their construction, and the objects that researchers found in the castle when it was liberated by American troops on the 2nd of April 1945 speak clearly enough about the intention. Wikipedia members of the SS received from Himmler rings engraved with skulls and mystical symbols. When an SS member died, those death rings were taken to Wewelsburg and placed in a box. The number of rings that had arrived at the castle by the end of the war was, according to witnesses of the liberation, several hundred. War history. Online. After the Allies took control of the castle, a round table with 12 chairs was also discovered, a reference to King Arthur and his knights. The full inventory of what was found in Wewelsburg in April 1945 also included the plans for an entire city, the new Wewelsburg, that Himmler planned to build around the castle, with a circumference of 12 kilometers and all buildings designed to converge architecturally on the North Tower as the focal point of the SS universe, and a library with thousands of volumes on occultism, runes, Norse mythology, alchemy, and the pseudo-scientific research of the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research Institute that Himmler financed with contributions from his friends of the SS Circle. James Twining Himmler, ordered the destruction of the castle before the Americans arrived. On the 31st of March 1945, a special detachment tried to blow it up. The fire they caused destroyed parts of the south wing and the east wing, but the north tower, the one containing the Obergruppenführersaal and the crypt, survived. The spaces that Himmler had built to last 1,000 years survived the destruction attempt ordered by Himmler himself. Today, Wewelsburg Castle houses a museum and a memorial. The rooms of the North Tower are open to visitors. The black sun on the floor of the Obergruppenführersaal is visible and documented. The crypt, with its 12 empty pedestals and its ventilation system prepared for a flame that never burned over the urns of the fallen generals, can be visited. Since the 90s, the sun wheel on the floor has been adopted as a symbol by neo-Nazi and far-right groups around the world, as documented by Wewelsburg's own museum in its educational material. The building survived, the symbolism survived, and the subsequent use of that symbolism is part of the story the castle still tells. When the last SS units guarding the Walliam-Rzeczka complex abandoned the Owl Mountains in May 1945, they did two things before leaving. They walled up with concrete all the entrances to the Project Reese tunnels and disappeared. The prisoners who were still working inside, whose number researchers estimate between 7,000 and 30,000 people, mostly Hungarian Jews transferred from Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen, did not come out with them. The mass graves of those prisoners have never been found. There are no records of evacuations. There is no documentation of transfers to other camps. There are no survivors who have given testimony of having come out of the tunnels in those days. The conclusion that historians of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance have formulated with careful caution, and which sources such as In Your Pocket Wrocław and Historic Mysteries have expressed more bluntly, is the most terrifying possible. It is likely they sealed them inside. Today, visitors who tour the open sections of the Ossowka or Włodarz complex walk through 5-meter-high concrete galleries in silence, with the sound of water leaking through the cracks in the rock. Beyond the illuminated sections, the corridors go into the darkness toward flooded or blocked sections that no one has opened since 1945. What is at the end of those corridors is not known. What researchers do know is that the men who excavated those tunnels by hand, with the nice rock as hard as steel cracking their fingers, never saw the light of day again. The concrete they put in is the same that has them locked inside.